Welcome back. This is the 6th and final video in the series of the reproductive system. If you like what I'm doing, please remember to subscribe. You'll find the little green gecko at the last part of this video. To really understand what's going to happen in this one, which ties all the other ones together, you have to remember the bits and pieces from the female reproductive system and the male reproductive system, and I'll help you put them together, because in this one we're going to look at the situation where fertilization occurs, implantation occurs, and a baby is born. So here we go. So let's start by looking at the female reproductive system, just recalling what was going on with the female reproductive system. And if this can represent an ovary, remember the oviduct ending with the fimbriae, and the uterus is down here, uterus down this part. What happens during the menstrual cycle is a Graafian follicle grows and grows and grows. It becomes a mature follicle called a Graafian follicle, and it actually protrudes at the surface of the ovary. So here we might have a mature follicle, Graafian follicle, and we get the LH spike, causes ovulation. This thing literally just pops out. Now it pops out into basically a fluid-filled space in the body. There's no structure in here around there, and that's the role of the fimbriae, because what they do, remember, is they undulate like this, and they cause a water movement or fluid movement, and it actually draws the fluid and the ovum into the oviduct. Now, if you remember the development of this ovum, there are 4 daughter cells, because it's a meiotic division, and there's only one ovum. And what happens in here is the other 3 daughter cells actually lose their cytoplasm to the favor of this one. This is an N cell, only has a single 23 chromosomes, and it has all of the cytoplasm and all of the enzymes and all of the nutrients that the other cells would have had. So those ones are called polar bodies, and they disintegrate. So what we have is one large cell that basically is just a big cell, and it enters into here. It's big enough and it's got enough nutrients in it that it can remain viable, alive if you like, for about 24 hours. But after about 24 hours, it will start to degenerate and it just becomes debris. As a large cell like this, it's unable to move. It doesn't have any cilia, for example. It doesn't have any flagella. It can't move. But what the oviduct does have, if you remember, is it has a muscularis layer, so it's a muscular tube, and it itself is lined with cilia. So this could represent the cilia. And remember, there's fluid in here and the muscle layer, and what they actually do is they move in a propelling type fashion, and they move that ovum to the uterus. How long does it take to get there? Well, it's a slow process. This is several inches long, and it can take maybe up to a week before it gets in. It gets through the oviduct. 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, it's down here, for example. And if fertilization hasn't occurred, like I said, it becomes debris, and it's just a single cell. It's shed through the vagina. So that's the female part of it. Now, during intercourse, a penis ejaculates sperm, semen with sperm in it, into the vagina. I didn't draw the vagina, but the vagina is down in here under the cervix. So this is the vagina here, and the uterus is there. The sperm are ejaculated into this region here. Remember the structure of sperm. Sperm have the acrosome at the tip of their head, a midpiece, and a tail. And this has got mitochondria in it. The tail is just a flagellum. The DNA is in here. The acrosome is the key part at this stage here. What happens is these sperm, and millions of them during a typical ejaculation, millions of them enter the vagina. They come from an environment in the male system which is actually alkaline. Remember, semen has the buffer in it, bicarbonate ions. Well, these are used to an alkaline environment. The acrosome is a chemically sensitive tip, contains enzymes, and it's sensitive to the female system. The female system is acidic compared to the alkaline nature of the semen. And the acrosome is actually sensitive to the presence of progesterone, the hormone, female hormone progesterone. So what happens is the acrosome detects the chemical nature in here, and it lines the sperm up so that they're all headed like this. So here's the head. I won't try to draw the detail. And there's the flagellum, and there's millions of these. And they all actually go through the cervix, and they head towards the ovary, because that's where the progesterone is, that's where the chemical nature is that they're drawn towards. Now, if these two events happen to occur in a time frame where the ovum is viable and the sperm are viable, and these sperm, they stay viable longer than an ovum. Sperm can be viable for several days. So if ejaculation occurs, intercourse occurs, and an ovum is viable and it's up in the upper regions of the oviduct here, the fallopian tube, and it's, like I say, it's viable for maybe 24 hours, we can have, excuse me, we can have fertilization. And what happens is, very simply, when fertilization occurs, if this, I'll just represent the ovum here, and the sperm here, the acrosome makes contact with the membrane of the ovum, and I'll just draw the one sperm. It's not a very good sperm, but I'll just draw the one. There's millions of them possibly in this region. This acrosome contains enzymes, and the enzymes allow that head of the sperm to penetrate the ovum's membrane. And when that penetration occurs, a change goes through the membrane of the ovum, so no other sperm can do that. So this membrane here actually has a chemical change occurs in it, and it basically locks out all other sperm. So one sperm, one egg, there's your fertilization. In the event of twins, of course, it could be that there are two eggs at the same time, or the egg will split later in the case of identical twins. But in a circumstance like this, we have one sperm fertilizing one egg. The 23 chromosomes from here, have the opportunity to combine. Now, N plus N, you get back to the normal chromosome number of humans, which is 46. It takes maybe 30 hours to get these chromosomes so they all sort of match up and line up, because, you know, 23 chromosomes there, 23 chromosomes here from a different source. They have to pair up, so you get these ones match and those ones match and so on like that. But what you get after that period of time, and I'll just take this picture and put it over here, what you get after that period of time is you get a human cell. In terms of size, it's marginally bigger than an ovum, so it's a big cell. It's got 46 chromosomes all matched up into 23 pairs. And what happens after those 30 hours is it starts to divide by mitosis. So we wind up with this cell producing two cells. And then those two cells each divide and you get 4 cells. And so on and so forth. These divisions occur about every 15 hours. So another 15 hours. Remember, we had 30 hours coming into this point. So another 15, another 15. So after about after a total of about 72 hours, which is 3 days, what we have here is a solid ball of cells. Maybe 16 cells. If you sort of figure it out here, it would be about 16 cells. It's either going to be 16, it might be 32 cells in here, something like that. But the thing is that these cells, there's been no growth. This total structure, multiple cell structure, is the same size as this. which is marginally bigger than this simply because of the addition of a little bit of material from the sperm. So we've got that cell, no growth. So these cells are becoming quite tiny, becoming much smaller and much smaller, smaller. This structure is called a morula. The solid ball of cells, usually we identify it at 16 cells, but it's also an 8-cell stage is still called a morula because it's still a solid ball of cells. This is not solid ball of cells yet, but if this were to divide again, you'd have this 8 cells, and it would be. So this structure here, the length of time, if you go back to this picture, this could be day 1, because this fertilization would have to occur, say, in the first day, because this is only viable for, 24 hours. So you give it 3 days, and by the 4th day, this ball of cells, the morula, is ready to enter the uterus. It's down here. I could draw it as a multiple set of cells, the morula, but it's the same size as that. It hasn't been any growth in the total, but no nutrients taken in. There can't be any growth. Solid ball of cells, morula gets in here, slightly different chemical environment again, because the chemistry changes as it goes along. And one of the things that happens when this solid ball of cells encounters this new chemical environment is it begins to hollow out. So what we have is this ball of cells, by the time you get into here, the next day and next day, it becomes a hollow ball of cells. So the 32 cells which make it up are on the outside, and then there's another clustering of cells on the inside. So we have a hollowed out ball of cells, and this hollowed out ball of cells becomes known as a blastocyst. And inside this space is called a blastocoel. And if you remember in previous biology courses, you may have come across the term coelom, which is the body cavity. So we have this blastocoel, which is the inside. And these things here are called blastocoels in there. These cells. These become the embryo. These are the embryonic cells. They have the potential to become the embryo. So what we have is this outer ball of cells, the embryonic cells which are inside that. And that structure exists along in here. Now, sooner or later, this structure is going to come into contact with the wall of the uterus. The contact surface here, these cells on the outside react slightly with the cells. Remember, these cells were engorged with blood at this stage, becoming rich and secretory, and this is able to actually attach. So it attaches here. This attachment becomes the placenta. And what happens, quite simply, is the cells around it, the placental cells are called, and the wall of the uterus, they start to grow into each other. So you wind up with cells from the embryo side and cells from the mother side become a single structure. And what this single structure is, it's the placenta, and it becomes a network of blood vessels. Maternal blood, embryonic blood, which becomes fetal blood, and that's the organ of exchange. So in the mother's system, oxygen is delivered to the fetus, and food is delivered to the fetus, and urinary waste, for example, are delivered from the fetus back to the mother and back and forth. Now we've had 2 events happen here, and I haven't identified exactly what happens when. Here we have the event called fertilization. Fertilization normally occurs up here. Fertilization is not necessarily just the encountering of the sperm with the ovum. Fertilization is when the chromosomes successfully match up. It is possible for an encounter to occur. The chromosomes don't match up. Cell division doesn't happen. That wouldn't qualify as fertilization. The other event that happens is implantation, and implantation is right here. When the two tissues grow into each other and the structure becomes attached, becomes implanted into the inner wall of the uterus, and the placenta begins to develop. That's implantation. That's not pregnancy yet. It's getting closer to pregnancy, but it's not pregnancy yet. Something has to happen first. And the thing that has to happen, I'll just take this away, is this placenta that's developing here, the combination of the maternal and the embryonic tissues, has to begin to secrete a hormone. This new tissue develops, and there's a hormone that's called HCGH. Great term. Human chorionic gonadotropic hormone. Human, so we're dealing with humans, chorionic gonadotropic hormones. Remember, gonadotropins are those hormones that affect, or tropic hormones are the ones that affect the gonad. So this one is from the chorionic membrane of the embryo here, the developing embryo, and it is released by the placenta into the mother's tissue, into the mother's blood, rather. So this human chorionic gonadotropic hormone, which is produced here, goes into the mother's blood, and once it's in the mother's blood, it travels around her body, like the blood always travels around the body, and it will eventually arrive here. So HCG, HCGH, I mean the last word is always hormone, so HCG affects the ovary. And what HCGH does is it prevents the corpus luteum from degenerating. Now you have to remember from the last video what the heck the corpus luteum was. After ovulation, the corpus luteum is what's left of the follicle cells, and it becomes that tissue which would degenerate after about 10 days. It becomes a tissue that secretes progesterone. Progesterone is maintaining this inner lining. If the progesterone levels drop, menstruation happens. You don't want menstruation to happen. You don't want to lose that inner lining. That would cause the placenta to be lost out the vagina. So by maintaining progesterone, menstruation isn't going to happen. The lining isn't going to be sloughed off, but this thing would normally degenerate after about 10 days. HCGH, human chorionic gonadotropic hormone, prevents that from happening. It maintains the corpus luteum, which in turn maintains the inner lining of the uterus. Eventually, after a few months, the placenta itself produces progesterone. Eventually, once the placenta begins to produce its own progesterone, then the HCGH isn't required, the corpus luteum can degenerate, and the ovary can go back to an original condition. There's another thing that HCGH does, though. It also maintains FSH and LH levels in the female. And what these do is they prevent, as long as these levels are high enough, it prevents menstruation. Right? So as long as these hormones are maintained, menstruation's not going to occur. Now, we're ready to identify exactly when pregnancy is. Pregnancy is identified as that point in time, or that period at which this hormone begins to be produced. Because we know once that hormone's produced, this system isn't going to degenerate. And that's the beginning of pregnancy. Pregnancy is marked as the beginning of the production of HCGH. This is the very hormone that pregnancy tests test for in urine. That's what a pregnancy test looks for. So it's a urine-soluble hormone. Excess HCGH is urinated out of the body, and it can be detected very simply with a little dipstick. So now we have it. The events: fertilization, implantation, pregnancy, and the baby begins to develop. This development, the pregnancy time of itself, is usually divided up and considered into trimesters. So we have a first trimester, trimester 1, 2, and 3. A pregnancy, a normal pregnancy, is somewhere in the, it's 39 weeks, or that sort of thing. So we've got, if you take it, or 40 weeks, you divide it up into trimesters. The first 10 weeks or so, the first third roughly, is until the placenta starts developing its own HCG. So this period in here is when everything becomes established. It follows implantation. The baby's organs begin to develop. And that sort of thing. In trimester 2, in the middle portion of the pregnancy, the mother would feel movement, that sort of thing. This is the very sensitive one here, because you want the organs to develop normally. You don't want abnormality in there. It's very important all the way through, but the mother begins to detect movement, and this can be somewhat uncomfortable at times. In the third trimester, the movement is a little bit different. There's more of a weight gain, and the discomfort changes from this type of discomfort to discomfort because of the size and development here. Different pressures being put on, the tissues of the lower back, on the bladder, and that sort of stuff. So there's a different level of discomforts in there. So a pregnancy has 3 trimesters. This is the most important one, in my way of thinking anyway, because it's the most delicate as far as the organs developing, and the pregnancy is well on its way in here. The baby begins to move, and then discomfort because of weight gain. The reason I mention that is because it's the weight and size gain that causes birth. And that sounds kind of weird, but if we go back to the picture, I can just maybe trade the picture here and erase all this stuff, the sperm down there thing. We've got a baby developing in here. This uterus can sometimes grow to 10 times its normal size because it's quite large, and the baby's growing inside there. It's putting pressure on all sorts of organs. We're talking in this period of time here. One of the things it puts pressure on is the cervix. Remember, the cervix is that opening, that ring of tissue at the bottom of the uterus and the top of the vagina. There's the cervix right here. And it puts pressure on the cervix. When it puts pressure on the cervix responds by sending a little nerve impulse up to the hypothalamus and to the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus produces 2 hormones. One of them we dealt with in the urinary system, and that's the antidiuretic hormone. The other one is a little hormone, only a very short hormone, like 9 amino acids long, oxytocin. Oxytocin. Oxytocin from the posterior pituitary is released into the blood, it travels around the body and in the blood like all good hormones do, and it affects the muscles of the uterus. Oxytocin causes the uterus to contract. Well, now you think about it for a quick second. The effect of contracting the uterus is going to wind up putting more pressure on the cervix. So the cervix responds by releasing more nerve impulses which go up to the posterior pituitary and releases more oxytocin. Oxytocin causes the uterus to contract. So we've got a positive feedback system here. Uterine contraction, more oxytocin, more uterine contraction, more oxytocin, and you wind up with getting labor pains. And that's what labor pains are. As the system builds and builds and builds, getting really close to birth, the contractions of the uterus become quite intense, and it's just one contraction after another contraction, and they actually build and build and build, and the only way out of that system, like the only way out of any positive reinforcement system, is there has to be a significant change. And the significant change we're talking about here is birth. Because birth, the baby is released through the cervix after dilation, through the vagina. There's no pressure. The pressure's gone. There's no nerve impulse to the posterior pituitary, no oxytocin, and it's over. And it's followed by the afterbirth, the delivery of the baby first. The afterbirth is the delivery of the placenta and the umbilical cord. And if you need to go back and review placenta and umbilical cord, that's in the circulatory system when we had the video on fetal circulation. If you like, I'll put a link at the end of this video back to that video so you can go back and look at fetal circulation. You'll be reminded about the umbilical cord and the placenta. So that wraps it up. This video, we dealt with the female system and what it's like as far as lead up to fertilization and implantation. The male system a little bit in terms of the release of sperm and what their role in this story is. We had our fertilization, implantation, pregnancy, and birth. Thank you very much.